and the drivers are saying that they won't work until it reopens. Now, Kani used to be the main export and import point for Gaza, but when Hamas took over, Israel closed it, except for gravel and grain, and now Israel has shut it down completely.
Kani is a well-prepared crossing for security and infrastructure. It's cheaper. It's closer to the city, to the factories, to the warehouses and to the wholesalers. In addition, from the Israeli seaport to the crossing, it's only 35 to 40 kilometres. But Kerem Abu Salem is 3 times further than Kani, and its capacity is very limited. It's also more expensive.
Now, Israel says that it's closed the Kani crossing for security reasons and that it's expanding the capacity of the Kerem Abu Salem crossing. But for people in Gaza, that's not enough, and businessmen and drivers here, they don't believe Israel. They say that they had a perfectly good crossing in the first place that never should have been closed, and that this is in fact another attempt by Israel to tighten the siege. Nicole Johnston, Al Jazeera, Rafah.
Plenty more ahead this news hour, including this.
Changing gears, how drivers in Spain are having to slow down on the nation's highways as a result of the crisis in Libya.
And one of the world's most active volcanoes puts on a spectacular display. The news hour returns in just a moment.
Taken stolen goods and he's now dumping them onto the world without any sort of consideration for consequences.
From people making the news.
If the North will be saved a lot of trouble, I think it is important that they should come together.
To those it affects.
We do accept that there was very bad mistakes made in our banking area.
Behind the headlines.
Most South Koreans are not interested in reunification.
Is the inside story. At this time on Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera is journalism without frontiers.
Police are pushing the protesters and the media back off of the street.
From the mainstream.
Who will pay the ultimate price for this disaster?
To the unreported world.
Taking the less traveled path often gives you a fresh perspective.
Breaking the boundaries.
This is almost certainly the largest leak of military information in history.
Cutting through the hype.
You can see the angry exchanges outside the Ministry of Transport.
Al Jazeera is setting the news agenda.
You're on the news hour on Al Jazeera, and these are our top stories. The Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi staging a fight back as his forces push east to retake the oil port of Ras Lanuf. This, though, has been Jawad just to the west, which has apparently been already reclaimed by government forces. But Colonel Gaddafi may also be seeking dialogue. A former prime minister has appeared on state television urging the opposition forces to talk. Gaddafi himself, you saw him there, making a brief appearance as well in Tripoli's Green Square overnight. And Shia Muslims in Bahrain have staged fresh protests calling for more rights. The protesters held a demonstration in front of the US Embassy in the capital, Manama, today. Now, the unrest in Libya is causing all sorts of new fears for the global economy. Attacks on oil depots, slowing production there have caused US crude oil to hit a 2.5-year high above $106 a barrel. As a result, the markets have been hit. London's FTSE 100 index fell about 0.5% in early trade, and Tokyo's Nikkei was down 1.8% in Asian trading. So with these oil prices rising, the Spanish government's decided to bring in some measures to cut fuel consumption. Sonia Gallego has more on that.
There's a change of pace happening on highways throughout Spain. Across the country, drivers are being encouraged to ease off the pedal, and it's all in aid of conserving energy. The unrest and uprisings experienced in oil-rich Arab countries have meant a surge in the price of petroleum, spelling trouble for countries dependent on imports.
Well, we are pretty sure, because we have made a lot of studies dealing with this problem, and our conclusion is that we save at least 0.7 liters per 100 kilometers.
Around 80% of the country's energy relies on imported oil and gas. That's a fifth above the average for the entire European Union. So for the next 4 months, the speed limit on Spain's highways goes down from 120 kilometers per hour to 110. That, says the government, will reduce oil imports by 5%, saving the country just over $3 billion.
Well, Libyan oil currently accounts for just over 13% of Spain's demand. And while Spain's oil supplies are in no danger just yet, the reduction in this national speed limit is just one of the ways that the government is trying to get people to cut down on fuel. And that's a scenario that's not been seen in this country since the 1973 oil crisis.
Also approved increased use of biofuels, a modest reduction in train fares and subsidised tyre exchanges. But with a sluggish economy still struggling its way out of the recession, the measure hasn't exactly been welcomed with open arms, with many seeing it as a ploy to distract the country from other problems.
I think that there are more important things that the government should be concerned with, and they shouldn't be wasting people's time and money on this.
It is laughable. It doesn't really contribute anything to the economy in general, if that is what it's about.
While oil prices remain high, the debate goes on over what alternatives there are for Spain's energy consumption. A sign of the times in an increasingly shaky climate. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, Madrid.
Tariq Youssef with us again in the studio from the Dubai School of Government, talking us through this myriad of events going on, not really moving so fast, actually, in Libya, it must be said. So we look outside, those oil shocks, as were. It shows the effect, even though Libya doesn't export to that many countries, the fear that drives the markets and the oil markets at the moment.
Absolutely. I think Libya has managed to export its problems to the world economy at the moment in the form of market sentiment, affecting not just oil markets, gold, silver, a host of commodities that are concerned about broader stability in the Arab world. And this is creating perhaps more drag on the so-called recovery that we were all expecting in 2011. This is another factor that the world community needs to take into account as it manages the crisis in Libya.
But don't you think it's just a potential shock, almost a blip? I don't want to undermine the importance of what's going on in Libya, but it's the type of thing where the recovery is going on elsewhere. This could just be a short, sharp shock, perhaps.
Possibly. I think markets will absorb the shock initially and factor it in. But if prices remain above $110, if gold and silver and other commodities prices rise, those high levels could prove to be a drag on economic recovery. And we've seen in the US in the last 2 days efforts to supply more refined products through the strategic reserve that the United States has, just to quell the perceived or the expected increase in the cost of gasoline. Prolonged instability in Libya, perceptions that the whole Middle East could possibly be affected by it, or this so-called spring of discontent, to the extent that this is perceived to have a possibility of spreading to other countries, the more markets are likely to